Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to this session on writing the dissertation, the introduction and conclusion. My name is Elliot. I'm the University Specialist Writing Tutor. This is part of a series called Writing the Dissertation. You might be familiar with some of the other sessions I've done. You might have come to some of the live ones or watched some of the recordings. But there are other sessions in this series of Writing the Dissertation where I break the dissertation or an extended piece of writing down into various chapters and stuff. So please, I'd encourage you to look at those other sessions if you haven't already. They're all recorded and they sit on the library's training and workshops page. If you're here watching this live now as opposed to the recording, I've put the link in the chat, so take a look at that. So this is what we're going to do more specifically in today's session. So sort of the two overarching aims, we're going to think about the importance of the introduction and conclusion as interdependent chapters or sections of a dissertation or an extended piece of writing. And the reason that's important for me is because I find often the intro and conclusion is they're the two parts that are sometimes neglected. I mean, often people leave the intro and conclusion, obviously the conclusion in particular, to the end, and sometimes you're tight for time, you're tired because it's a long piece of work, and you just want to get it done. And I think that with the introduction in particular is a real shame. So this is partly me trying to relay the importance of both chapters or sections. And so to do that, I've done the session with the intro and conclusion together because I think I'm going to show you how important it is that the two are treated together. So we're going to do that, and we're going to think particularly about the structure. I'm basically going to give you two structural templates, one for the intro, one for the conclusion, and we are going to then look at a good intro and a good conclusion, both from the same dissertation. You're going to see how the two work together. You're going to follow the structure that I give you. And so I hope it's sort of very clear, very instructional. I can give you sort of a clear guidance on how to do both. There's a couple of models we're going to look at. One's called SPRE, one's called CARS. So we're going to look at both of those. I'll explain what those are in a minute. And so we're going to break it into two, basically look at that in relation to the intro, then we'll look at the conclusion and see how that's structured as well. So that's what we're going to do. Any questions as we go throughout, please do let me know. Just to stress, I've mentioned it in the chat already for those of you here watching this live now. There is a Word document, a PDF document that's been circulated to you via email. The examples we're going to look at, both are in those documents. You only need one of them. They're both the same content-wise. Everybody should have that. If you don't, please send me a message on the chat and I can send it over to you. But you'll need that for the for later on in the session. If you are watching a recorded version of this, you will be able to see the examples on the slides. Okay, just very quickly, before we actually get started with looking at the intro, looking at the conclusion, looking at the examples, I just want to do a very, very quick exercise. I just want you to use the chat to put your answers in here. So in a minute, I'm just going to show you 5 statements, 5 very, very short statements, okay, which when arranged in a particular order, really any order you want, make up a story from start to finish, right? All I want you to do is I want you to arrange the statements in the order that you think is correct from start to finish. And I want you to put the sequence in the chat. So A, D, C, B, E, for example. So you can just type it in like that. You'll see that each statement has a letter next to it. So I'm going to show you these statements. All I want you to do is read through, just take a minute to read through them. And then when you're ready, type the correct sequence in the chat in order from start to finish. That's literally all I want you to do, and then I will explain. I'll explain why we're doing that. So here they are. So just take 1 minute to do that, and then when you're ready, start putting it in the chat. Okay, so we've all had a chance to look at that. We've just spent a minute. We've not spent very long on that because I just want you to almost act instinctively really with this. We've got quite a few responses in the chat and everybody has gone with the same sequence, which is very unusual. I've done this many, many times. There's normally, and as I say, that somebody's done a different sequence. That's good. That's good. I'm happy with that. Most people have gone with A, E, D, C, B, which is Martina had always wanted to travel. Martina was afraid of flying. Martina sailed around the world and saw many sights. She had a new appreciation for other countries and cultures. Finally, finishing with she was satisfied with life. Okay, so most have gone with that. The one difference is that we've got one that starts with satisfied with life, then had always wanted to travel, then was afraid of flying, then sailed around the world, then had a new appreciation for other countries and cultures. Okay, so I said you can't really go wrong with this, and I think both the structures we've got there are very, very logical to me. Like, that makes complete sense. Just out of interest, if anybody wants to put in the chat why you settled on that sequence, given that there's multiple different sequences you could pick. Why that sequence? What's going on there that dictates the choices you made in terms of A first, then E, or B first, then A? If you could type a few words in the chat, that would be really, really helpful, just in terms of what's happening here. What made this hopefully a relatively straightforward exercise? Okay, so somebody said the main point question mark. That is quite vague, quite a few words. It needs a start, middle, and an end. Yeah. Sequence. Okay. Hopefully some of it was given away when I sort of said to you here, it needs to be linear and logical. All right. So it needs to be start to finish. So often people are like, well, you know, it's start to finish. It makes sense like that. Somebody's sort of saying A is the instigation of the idea. Yeah. Okay. Some good stuff there. All right. So I'm just so we get through this bit quickly. I am going to just enlighten you a bit more with this, why we've done this, and then I'm going to tell you what relevance this has to what we're doing now. So the reason I always do this exercise, the reason I think it is relatively straightforward to do, and despite having very different backgrounds, cultural experiences, all of us here, often we're able to arrange this in an order that makes sense, not only to us, but to other people. So most of us have gone with AEDCB, and I've put here what I thought you'd go for. Now, this does not mean you can't do it in other ways, and I think you definitely can. I think you can even do it in ways that might at first seem unusual. But AEDCB, I think, is absolutely the most, if not for me personally, the most logical order, then certainly the one that comes up most of the time that people do, and sort of proved that point here with everybody, well, most people going for AEDCB. So I think some of you touched on what's going on here. And fundamentally, the reason this structure makes sense is because it's a logical linear structure. It makes sense from start to finish. And there's a beginning and there's a middle and there's an end. Now, we're all familiar with stories, whether they're short stories or long stories, films, books, whatever. We're all familiar with stories. And whether we're aware of it or not, we're actually all storytellers. We're all storytellers because we're all familiar with the way that stories, traditional stories, are structured. I'm stressing traditional stories like fairy tales, for example, because I don't want you to get down the sort of Tarantino, Chris Nolan route where they've got the beginnings at the end and the middles at the start and this kind of stuff. Traditional storytelling, right? There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. And there's expectations from us as the reader or the audience as to what each part is doing. So we've got our beginning, we've got our middle, and we've got our end here. And we've got our beginning because what we've got is we have got a state of existence, something that exists in the real world or in the world of the fiction. But what we have to have in the story for it to actually have any purpose whatsoever is a problem. We have to have this. We have to have something that disrupts the situation. We have to have a problem like this. Then what we have in a story, and what most of a story is the attempt to resolve that problem. It's the journey. So here's your problem. Here's what they did to overcome that problem. And then, arguably here C and B, but certainly B, there is a resolution to it. So there is a sort of an end. Everything is settled. There's a definitive end. If you did B first, that would also work. That could be the situation, right? That could be the state of existence. But she'd always wanted to travel. She was afraid of flying, would still be the problem. So there's lots of different ways you could do this. For it to make sense, whatever order you put them in, it has to follow this logical linear order of beginning, middle, and end, and what each part is doing for it to make sense. And that's, I think, what we're all familiar with, whether we're conscious of it or not. That's what's happening here. Now, the reason this is really, really important, yes, there are differences, huge differences sometimes to how we tell stories and how we write academically, but there's also a lot of similarities, and structure is one of those. The way that structure functions in a piece of academic research, like what you're doing to some extent with a dissertation or an extended piece of writing, that is structured in much the same way as a story. and here I will prove it to you. So the SPRE model, which stands for Situation, Problem, Response, Evaluation, is the dominant model that structures and dictates the structure of an original piece of research. If you look at journal articles and stuff, they all have this structure to varying extents, but they all have this structure. There has to be a situation, there has to be a problem, there has to be a response, there has to be some sort of evaluation of how effective that response was. So this idea of a situation, a problem, response, evaluation is, despite the differences in topics and issues that you're addressing in your dissertations, everybody's going to be doing this to some extent, particularly this problem here. The problem in a story and in an academic piece of writing is absolutely essential. If you imagine a film without a problem, you're probably going to have a really boring film. And sometimes you do watch films and you think that was incredibly boring and nothing happened. It's probably because there isn't a big problem or an obvious problem that disrupts the whole situation. So that's sort of what's happening here. If we go back here, we can map this SPRE model onto this. Not so much the evaluation, you wouldn't call it evaluation in a story, it's more resolution, but the idea of a situation, we've got a problem, we've got a response here. Now, this is a structure that dictates the whole of your paper, the whole of your dissertation. But the reason this is really, really important to cover in this session, and the reason why an introduction is really, really important, is because the introduction covers the situation, it covers the problem, and it covers the response. Now, most of the dissertation is the response, but the situation, problem, and response, so 3 of the 4 parts structurally, are actually covered in the introduction. So that on its own should tell you how important the intro is. Now, situation, problem, response, those 3 parts, we're going to see how that maps onto this model. So this is a model that has sort of been researched and rigorously tested, that is the best, most consistent, direct model to help you structure an introduction. It's called CARS, or Creating a Research Space, which is effectively what an intro is about. It's creating a space for you to move into. Now, there's 3 parts to this model, to this structure of CARS. Move 1, move 2, move 3. We call it establishing a territory, establishing a niche, and occupying a niche. I'll explain what each one does in more detail in a minute. Just for now, it's important to note that I've put it in this pyramid, upside down pyramid. And that's important because what your introduction does effectively is it moves from a broad position to a narrow position. And the narrow position is what you're doing and how you're doing it. And the broad position is that whole context and situation that you need to map out before you tell the reader what it is you're doing. So let's go into these 3 steps in more detail now. Then what we're going to do is we're going to see an example of this in action. So move 1, which is right at the top of our upside down pyramid, which means it's very, very broad. Okay, so you're starting really, really broad. A lot of people, particularly with short essays, start with this essay is going to do this, or if it's a dissertation, this dissertation is going to do this. It's not the place to start, particularly with something like this. What you need to do instead is you need to ease the reader into the context within which your research focus, exact research focus, sits. Now, this is the establishing a territory part of this CARS model. If we use the SPRE model that we just looked at, we'd call this the situation. So you could call this establishing a territory, you could call it establishing a situation. The situation means there is a world that exists, or a part of the world that exists out there in the real world that my research focus sits within. And that's what the territory or the situation is. Now, there's different things you can do in this part, but basically it's working through any information that you think helps to ease your reader into the context. So claiming centrality, like stating the value and importance of the research topic. I mean, not necessarily your exact specific research topic, but generally the research you're interested in. You often find there's some somewhat generalizations in this part, not in a negative sense, but some broader statements that relate to current knowledge. You'll notice there I put literature review at the bottom. I'm not going to emphasize this too much because many of you will have a literature review chapter, and if you do, then you can basically ignore this. I mean, you can use some literature in this part, and you should do, but it's not a review of literature so much. If you're doing something like in humanities or law, then you will quite possibly have your literature review, or a fairly short literature review, in this part of the introduction. So this can be actually quite a substantial part of the introduction. So this bit is all about establishing a world that exists. It's about giving your reader context. That I think is still quite vague at this moment in time, but I'm going to show you through an example of ways that you can do that. So I don't want to overstress it now. So we'll look at an example in a minute. Once you've done that, and that's potentially quite a few words that you would need to use, bear in mind that you're starting to narrow your focus. You're going to get sort of midway down this upside down pyramid. So you're still quite broad, but you're starting to narrow your focus. What you're now going to do is establish a niche. And a niche is a very small part of something. It's a very particular angle or a particular perspective or a particular part of something. Now, this is the bit we're going to call problem of the SPRE model. So we've done situation. Now we're going to narrow down to a problem. Now this problem is, notice here the second bullet point there, identifying a gap. This is something you've probably heard of before. You've heard some variation of this before, which is you need to find a gap. You need to find a problem. This basically means that in order to justify why you're researching what you're researching and why you're approaching it in the way you are, you need to identify something that hasn't really been done before. Now, this doesn't mean something completely brand new. It might mean something that needs redoing, needs to be researched in a slightly different way, needs to be updated. I talk a bit about this in a bit more detail in the literature review recording, so have a look at that if you want to know more on that. But that's basically what it means. Establishing a problem means, well, what hasn't been done before, or what needs to be updated, or what needs to be improved. And that's what we mean here by identifying the gap. So that's what's happening here. This is you sort of saying, taking a step back and saying, well, we've narrowed down, we've given context, we've narrowed down to this particular area, and now we're going to establish a particular problem that exists. Here's an issue that needs to be addressed. And what that does is it instigates the third and final part of the intro, which is right down here, so very narrow at this point. It's the response part, or occupying a niche. So if move 2 is establishing a niche, so establishing a small part of that research, a small part of that context, move 3 is where you move into that niche. You actually move into that particular area. And this is the bit that most people are familiar with. This is the bit where you say what you're going to do, how you're going to do it. And so this is the response part. And this, again, is why I'm saying the SPRE model is so important in the intro context, because it covers the situation, the problem, and the response. These do, by the way, come back in some capacity in the literature review. And again, I sort of talk about that overlap in the literature review session. So this is the response part. This is you now saying, well, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to do it. There's some important parts of this. You have to outline your purpose, which is normally an aim, just a general aim. It has to be something that's sort of general enough to encompass the whole dissertation or project, but specific enough that it's actually pinpointing something you're going to do. It doesn't have to, but it might establish an argument, or what we call a thesis statement. This, again, is more common in humanities style, the humanities style of writing, maybe law, some social sciences. This is basically where, if we use a storytelling example again, this is a bit like telling the end of your story at the beginning, which isn't something you really want to do in a story, but in a paper, in a dissertation like this, it's quite common. So this is you saying, well, this is what I'm doing here. This is what I'm going to prove to you at the end. So it's potentially providing some of your principal findings, or it's establishing a line of argument that you're going to follow. You don't have to do this if you're not sure whether you need to. You can ask me. I can give you some guidance in terms of whether it's common in certain disciplines or not, but certainly talk to your supervisor. You don't have to do it though, but you need to outline your purpose. Obviously, it needs to be clear what you're doing. And you need to map out your structure. You need to actually explain chapter to chapter what you're going to do, which is fairly straightforward if it follows the typical structure. The other thing I haven't really put here is stuff like objectives and sort of research questions. All of that stuff goes in here. I mean, you won't have the entire full context yet, because the literature review will do some of that if you don't have a literature review in your intro. But you want to get your objectives in there, questions, that kind of stuff. So that all comes into this part here. So that was a very quick whirlwind tour of that model, the CARS model, and how the SPRE model informs that CARS model. What we're now going to do is look at an example. So I'm going to have a look at sample A. This is the bit where you need to look at your Word document or PDF document. So like I said, if you're watching this live, you should have had an email. If you haven't, let me know in the chat. If you are watching this recorded, you're going to see sample A in the next couple of slides, so you can pause the video when we get there. But just for us now, what I want you to do is just take a few minutes to read sample A. I'm not going to sort of ask you whether you think this is good or not. I'm just going to tell you up front, this is a really good intro. It's a fantastic dissertation generally. It's a really good opening to the dissertation. What I want you to do is think about the three parts of this model that we've just been looking at and see if you can spot the three parts. Can you see sort of the bits where part one is glued to part two, for example, and where part two is glued to part three? But all I want to do pretty much is just read sample A, just get familiar with the structure, and then I'm going to talk you through it and pick some parts out for you. So I'm going to give you some silence to do that. Any issues, any questions, let me know. I will give you at least 3 or 4 minutes to do that. Don't worry if you don't get a chance to finish it. It's not a problem. We're going to look at it afterwards anyway. So sample A, have a look at that. Any questions, let me know. And I'm going to go back to this slide here just so you can see the three parts again. So just give you a few minutes to do that. So we've had a chance to look at sample A, which, as I said, maps onto this structure of the cars model really, really well. It's a really good intro. So if you are watching this recorded and you obviously want to read through the example that we've just been reading through in the live session, then this is part of it here. So you can pause the video and have a read of that. So it obviously starts on the left, moves over here onto the right. This is the rest of it. And then that's the last couple of paragraphs there. So I've just highlighted some parts that I want to talk through, and just to sort of elaborate on what makes this a really good intro, just to help you spot some of those structural components that I've been talking about. Any questions, anything you're not sure about, drop it in the chat as I'm talking through, and I will elaborate on that for you. If you look at that first sentence there, like that first sentence that starts with the unprecedented rise in the popularity of social media platforms, that is a pretty archetypal opening sentence of a dissertation. Like, it's really broad in its scope. You don't from that get a clear indication as to what the dissertation is actually about or what it's doing, but you don't need that here. All you need is to be eased into context. And because of the breadth and the scope of that statement and the themes and the ideas it's dealing with, as I sort of highlighted here, social media, paradigm shift, communication, that indicates to you as a reader, particularly your markers that will be familiar with introductions and papers and dissertations, that speaks to your reader in terms of, you know, this is the opening to this dissertation, and it clearly reads like that in terms of its scope. You'll notice they start to bring in research here, there's some more here, there's a little bit more throughout. It's interesting how they're using the research here. Sometimes people say to me, should I not use research in the intro? Should I leave that to the lit review if I have a lit review chapter? But you can absolutely, you probably should really use literature in your intro to give that context. But there's two types of literature here, or at least the literature has been used in two different ways. First one here, we've got this multiple citation, we've got multiple sources here. That information there has been sort of briefly referred to just as a way of providing context. The deeper into the intro you go, through here, this stuff here, the deeper you go, the more they're engaging with the literature. Now, this is sort of what I mean by you can do a mini literature review in your introduction, even if you have a literature review chapter, because you need to do a little bit of that context to allow you to establish the gap and the problems and the justification of what you're doing. So that's why there's research in here, but it's been used in different ways. You've sort of got brief reference to literature here as context. This is all still to do with context, but you notice particularly Solomon and Howard here, they're starting to engage with literature more because it's more specific, it's more narrow, it's more related to what they're doing. And that's what's going on here. And I refer back to the model that we were looking at, the upside down pyramid. From that first sentence, you read that first sentence there, you can see from that point on what they're doing is narrowing and narrowing and narrowing down. Now, if you look, for example, at the start of the second paragraph with these themes of empowerment, they then narrow down to a particular case study. And this case study of the Arab Spring is the case study they use in the dissertation. So that doesn't appear in the first paragraph. It doesn't appear in the first sentence. It could do, potentially. You know, you could be more narrow in the way you start, but they've decided to start broader than that and narrow down to Arab Spring as the context in terms of the case study. So notice how they've done that. They haven't gone straight in at the deep end and said, yeah, here's a case study that I'm interested in. I stress there's lots of different ways you can start in terms of context. You could be sort of really quite narrow in your context if you think there's a lot to say, or you could start really quite broad. They decided to start there, but then they narrowed down to the Arab Spring in the sort of second paragraph. So that signals a shift there. If we move on to the third paragraph here, this is where there's a structural shift, because everything that came up to this point is all situation, it's all context, it's all move one, establishing a territory, establishing a situation. The start of paragraph 2 moves into move 2, which is establish a niche or establish a problem. And that's what they're doing here. And you can see from the way they're phrasing this, however, whilst these people have done this, it results in this, and it has this problem, etc., etc. And what it then does is it moves into move 3. So move 2 and move 3, problem and response, are very closely interrelated. And that's because as soon as you tell the reader what the problem is, they expect the response to come. Same in a story. As soon as they're posed with a problem, you expect there to be a response. So this here in the same paragraph instigates the response. This identification of the problem here moves into the response. And this is where they say what they're doing and how they're doing it. So there's two particular sentences here. We've got one here and one here. This is like their aim here. This is sort of what they're focusing on, what they're trying to do. And then this is their argument here. Like I said, you don't need that argument, that thesis statement. You don't have to, but this is what this is their thesis statement here. This is their argument here. And you can see from the phrasing the difference. This dissertation argues. It's more specific. It's more targeted. It's more of an actual result or an argument. The rest of this, in terms of this paragraph here, then develops that discussion further in terms of what their response is, how they're doing it. Here are their questions. They formulate their questions here. These will appear again in the lit review if you have a lit review. So it's not that they're only addressed once, but you need them here in the intro for context and for that focus. And then this bit here, this last paragraph, is the structure. This is how I'm doing it, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, etc. And then they end on this sentence, which I quite like, which is that they sort of end on like an overarching focus, like what ultimately are they trying to achieve? And it gives a quite a nice rounded end to the introduction. Sometimes people aren't sure how to end the intro. Sometimes they just end with what the last chapter is going to do, which you can do. It's not too much of a problem. One of the ways that you can end is by doing this, like I said, sort of give it nice rounded overarching sort of aim or intended outcome. The other way you can do it is with this structure, the mapping of the structure here. In terms of chapter 1 or chapter 2, whatever your first chapter after the introduction is, you can sort of leave that to the end in terms of the list, in terms of saying I'm going to do this, then this, then this. You can actually, if you have the literature review, methodology, results, discussion structure, you can say, well, you're going to do the methodology, this is what you're going to do, then you're going to do results, then discussion. But then at the end of the intro say, firstly, however, the literature review will be, the relevant literature will be discussed, etc., etc. Because what that does is it creates a segue into the next chapter. So that's something else you can do, which is quite a nice way around it. So hopefully that will make sense in terms of the CARS model. You can see how that maps onto it, just in terms of here's our beginning, nice broad opening, themes and ideas are presented, or broad themes and ideas are presented right at the beginning. Some literature is used in there. It's used here as context. It's used here as context, but it starts to become more specific and more detailed. They're narrowing and narrowing at this point. They continue to narrow their focus to get to the gap and get to their aim. This shifts the focus onto the actual case study that they're addressing. This is still all move 1, though. This is still all context situation. Here is where they have their problem, and then that instigates the response, which is aim, argument, if you choose to have an argument. This provides more detail about how specifically they're approaching the topic in terms of what logistically are they doing, how have they organized the research. Here are some research questions. And then this is the mapping of the structure. As I said, it ends on a nice sort of overarching focus, sort of overarching statement that encapsulates everything that they're trying to achieve, which is nicely phrased. So I hope that makes sense. If you've got any questions, I've got a bit more to say about intro in a minute. But any questions about that in particular? I'll just give you a few seconds to think about that. You can put something in the chat. Okay, you might be in the middle of typing, which is completely fine, because I can sort of jump back and forth if you have any questions. That's not a problem. But let me just elaborate on a couple more points about the intro, and then we'll move on to the conclusion. If you do have anything, put it in the chat. That's absolutely fine. So I just want to make this point about something I call closing the narrative gaps. I've talked a lot about stories, structure of stories and stuff. Narrative is also something that relates to a story, and a lot of markers use the term narrative in terms of the development of your discussion. They always use this term narrative quite often, and sometimes that's confusing in terms of what they mean by that. Narrative, obviously, in a story context means the progression of the story. The narrative is the progression of the story. In an academic writing context, the narrative is sort of the way you're developing your discussion, the way you're moving the ideas forward, the way you generate forward momentum in the discussion of your paper. In a storytelling context, the way it works is that the narrative has to make sense, right? One scene into the next scene into the next scene has to make sense. Even one shot into the next shot has to make sense. If somebody throws a ball, you expect the next shot to be somebody catching the ball, and that makes logical linear sense to us. If you see somebody throwing a ball, and then the next shot you see is somebody, jumping into a swimming pool, you'd say there's a sort of a collision there, in the sense that there's a lack of fluidity in the narrative. There's something happening there. Now, often in stories, that's done on purpose for creative purposes, but you can't have those in writing. You can't have what I call narrative gaps. So just to put it, in a straightforward way, writing is defined by the fact that you have a succession of logical sentences that move in a linear way, right? Each sentence builds on the previous one and moves the narrative, moves the discussion in a forward motion. That's what it's about. But between every sentence, you have what I call this narrative gap, which is the point I was making with the images in a story, for example. Now, what you have to do is you have to close these gaps, which basically means you can't have big leaps in logic. You can't have one sentence that moves into a next sentence with a big leap in logic that doesn't make any sense. Now, the reason I'm saying this here is because this can happen anywhere, but it's most likely to happen in the introduction. And the reason it's most likely to happen in the introduction is because, particularly in the opening paragraphs of the introduction, you're dealing with very big ideas, and you're potentially having to make quite big jumps in terms of moving, for example, from the idea of social media to a social media platform, or the idea of moving from a particular area of study to a particular theory, or something like that. Now, something that's really good about this intro is it covers a lot, but I don't think there's any gaps in the narrative. Like, I think every sentence in relation to the previous one makes sense. Like, I don't feel like I move from one sentence to the next and I lose sight of what's going on or what's happening. And I'll just show you one example. There's lots of examples in here, but one example. This first sentence of paragraph 2, which starts with these themes of empowerment. I think this is an example of where you could easily have a big narrative gap, partly because you're moving from one paragraph to the next. But everything they've talked up to this point is the idea of empowerment, collective action, and social media, right? And they've used an example of SeaWorld here, the SeaWorld scandal. What they now want to do is introduce the Arab Spring uprising as an example of this. And what a lot of people do sometimes is they will just go straight in and introduce the Arab Spring. They'll say, in 2010, the Arab Spring uprising took place, for example. Now that, to me, albeit relatively briefly, would cause a gap, because I don't understand as a reader how you've moved from social media, collective action, empowerment, SeaWorld, to then the Arab Spring uprising. So it makes a subtle difference. But what they've done really well is they've introduced the Arab Spring uprising in the context of what they've been talking about. Think of it like Russian dolls. You've got a big doll and there's a smaller doll inside, and when you open it up, there's a smaller doll inside. Everything in an introduction has to fit inside something larger. So the Arab Spring uprising is introduced within the context of everything that's been discussed in here. These themes of empowerment were most vividly demonstrated in late 2010. So it's introduced within that context. And this closes the gap. So you don't have that big gap anymore. You don't have the potential as a reader of going from one point to another and not knowing how the two relate to each other. So be very, very careful of that. And I've said here, you can close gaps in two ways. Sometimes it's just that you need a transitional device. So for example, however, something like that, or a phrase like in response, something like that helps to close gaps. So there's quite a few of these in here. So you know, when you read it through, think about that. But the one I was talking about there is that sometimes you need to give content or context. Sometimes there's just something missing that you need to fill the gap so that that makes sense in relation to what came before. So just be careful of that. It's sort of a very brief overview of what I mean by narrative gaps, but be mindful of that. Just very, very briefly as well, before we move on to the conclusion. Intro, it's roughly should be about 5 to 10% of the overall word count. So if you're doing 10,000, it should be roughly 500 to 1,000 words, roughly something like that. It depends. If you've got a lit review in it, a significant lit review, it could be a lot longer. It's not a problem, but roughly it should be around 5 to 10%. Sometimes you're asked to do a personal motivation. If you do business, for example, sometimes personal motivation, that should really sort of come in and around the response part, I think, because a personal motivation isn't enough to provide justification for doing what you're doing. You also need that research gap, but personal motivation can be part of it as well. So you can include that if it's suitable for your discipline. Be mindful of overlap between intro and start of lit review. I talk a little bit about this in the lit review session, but you'll find sometimes that where you start in the intro can often overlap with where you start in the literature review, because they're both structured in the same way, broad to narrow. I think the difference between the two mainly is that the literature review is much more about academic context, whereas the intro is much more about social, cultural context. It's much more about the wider world. Literature review is much more about the research field, the world of the research. So there's a slight difference there. And how broad, I'm going to come back to that later. I'm not going to touch on that now. Okay. Bit short on time. Well, I mean, I'm going to run over the hour, but if you need to go, that's absolutely fine. You can catch up with the conclusion bit afterwards. But I'm not going to spend quite as long on this, but we've got another example to look at. So, any questions about that intro? Let me know in the chat. Hopefully, no questions so far. I'm hoping that sort of all makes sense. So, so that would be good. Okay, conclusion. So, intro is broad to narrow. Conclusion is actually flipped upside down. So imagine a pyramid the right way up. That's what a conclusion is. It starts narrow, and then what it does is the idea of it broadening out at the end. So I'm going to cover this briefly, and then we'll look at an example that will make a lot more sense. So we've got two parts in the conclusion. You've got three parts in the intro, but the sort of the second move, the establishing a niche or establishing a problem, is often a very small part. It's often the glue that binds 1 to 3 together. It's often the glue that binds context to your particular focus together. So you don't really have that glue so much in the conclusion. It's more just two parts. It's what I call summary and synthesis, and then wider relevant context. So summary and synthesis is a sense that you start your conclusion by reminding the reader what you've done, how you've done it, what problem you've tried to address, and principally what you found. You know, ultimately, this is what I found, this is what is interesting, what's the sort of main argument, what's the overarching conclusion that you've reached. The biggest mistake people make in the conclusion of any piece of work is that they just repeat everything that they've done. You don't need to do that. You need to remind the reader what you've done. You might restate the research problem here and then explain how you addressed it, just as a reminder. It's not that they don't know at this point, it's just a reminder. And then it's a summary and a synthesis of your main findings and discussion points. It's not recounting every point again. It's not recounting all the findings again. It's not recounting all the main points again. It's trying to bind everything together into a single cohesive whole. That's what it's about. Confirm and clarify your main argument is very, very important as well. If you've stated your argument in the intro, obviously it needs to be consistent with the conclusion. And obviously it all pieces together. You'll bring it together in that way. So that'll be the bit that most of you are familiar with, and we'll see an example of this in a minute. The second bit is what a lot of people don't do. It's what makes a really, really brilliant conclusion, is that you don't actually end on your argument. You don't end on a very specific point that you've addressed or the research problem that you've addressed necessarily, or how you've done it. You actually, at the end, you think more carefully about, well, how does what I've done fit into a wider world, into a wider context? So it's a bit like feeding what you've learned back into the wider context. Now, the best way to think of this is it's like what you're doing is you're going to go all the way back to the beginning of the intro, and you're going to revisit those same ideas and themes and feed what you've learned into that. And there's different ways you can do this. Sometimes you can talk about future research. Sometimes it can be even limitations. This is what maybe I would do next time. And that's sort of part of the wider context. But it's more than just that. It's thinking about the wider world. And it's thinking about how what you've done in an originality sense fits into the wider landscape. So not just research necessarily, but the wider world. Sometimes if you don't put this in the discussion, it can be sort of application in real world practice if it's that kind of dissertation, you know, that kind of stuff. So we'll talk more about this, but let's look at sample B. Sample B is the conclusion from the same dissertation we looked at, the intro came from. So that's sample B. So have a look at sample B. Again, just look at it generally, think about the structure. See if you can spot where the conclusion moves from summary and synthesis to wider context, so where it moves from 1 into 2. See if you can spot that. And then again, I'm going to elaborate on some of that, and we will sort of wrap it up after that. So have a look at sample B. I'll give you some silence to do that. If you need to get away for 3, obviously now will probably be a good time to get away, so please do. You can catch up with the rest of this in the recording. That's no problem at all. Any questions as you're reading that or waiting for us to start up again, then just drop me something in the chat. But I'll give you some silence to do that. So sample B, look at the conclusion, and I will stay on that slide there so you can see the structure. So we've had a chance to look at sample B. Don't worry if you're still reading it. If you're watching the recorded version, like the example earlier, you're going to see the example that we've just been looking at here on the slide. So again, it starts on the left, continues on the right. So if you want to pause that and have a look at that, and then that's the rest of it. So it's really useful looking at the conclusion from the same dissertation as the intro that we looked at, because what I want to show you, particularly in a few minutes with the end, is how closely linked these two parts or chapters are, how closely related they are. So we'll just go through some of the points I want to make, think about that structure, those two parts, and then I'm going to elaborate on some of those points. So I said earlier with the intro, the first sentence, that indicates clearly to your reader that this is the start of the dissertation because of the scope, the breadth, and the focus. It's the same here with the conclusion, but it's, as I said, reversed. If you notice that statement there compared with the first sentence of the intro is very, very narrow, very, very specific. And that is, again, like it sounds just like the start of a conclusion. You don't need the conclusion subheading to read that and know that that's the start of the conclusion for an experience marker. So it's a reminder really what they've done and what they've attempted to do, and that's a good place to start. You could start instead with the problem, as I said. You could start by saying, well, here's a problem as established earlier, and then you can explain how you've addressed that problem. So you can do that, but it's a really good start. They spend the rest of that sort of paragraph just expanding on what they've done in the dissertation, how they've approached it, and sort of the sort of overarching argument, the overarching point that they've made. And you should notice here throughout the whole conclusion really that there's never any point where they're sort of talking about specifics necessarily. They're never really saying, right, I did this, I showed this, and this, because it's not about that. It's not sort of reading from a list of points that have been made or anything like that. It's not like that. It's about trying to give an overarching picture of what your dissertation has achieved. It becomes a bit more specific, arguably, in the second sort of paragraph in terms of saying, you know, precisely what they did and stuff, but it's still fairly broad strokes. It's not lots and lots of detail. You don't need this in here. Bear in mind that by the time the reader reads the conclusion, they've read everything by this point. They don't need you to recap everything. They want the conclusion to be somewhat different to the rest of the dissertation. They want it to be sort of focused on that same dissertation topic, obviously, same focus, same argument, all this kind of stuff. But they don't want you to just repeat stuff that you talked about earlier. Otherwise, what would the point of the conclusion be? So it's clearly still focused on what they've done. Here's what they've sort of generally argued and generally what they've tried to do. Second paragraph, like I said, talks in a little bit more detail. This is what they did in chapter 2, chapter 3. Here's a bit more methodological stuff. The third paragraph here that I've highlighted there, whilst the Arab Spring only represents one case, this is where I would say they start to move into that second part. If I go back here, this is where I think they start to move into part 2, wider relevant context, here at the start of paragraph 3. And you can see, because now what they're doing is it's no longer about the Arab Spring uprising. It's no longer about that one case study. They're actually looking at how that case study speaks to wider issues about social media activism and community and all this kind of stuff. So that sentence there is a really nice indication that that's what they're doing. So now they're starting to move out. Their scope is starting to become wider. And this sometimes people think is a bit strange in a conclusion, because you feel like it should just say what you've done and end on that note. But the reason you do this, the reason you end on a wider note, is because the end of the conclusion in a research paper or dissertation isn't the end of, it's the end of the paper, it's the end of that research, but it's not the end of the research in general. And the reason they do this in papers, for example, is because people will look at what you've done and they'll adapt it, and they'll adopt parts of it, and they'll build on it, and they'll build on the knowledge. And that's what's happening here. It gets to the end, but it's not the end so much. You know, it's not the end of the research in terms of its forward movement. And this is very different to a story, because when you get the end of a story, unless they're setting it up for a sequel or something, you know, you want the end to have a clear resolution. You don't want there to be ambiguities, but there's an element of openness at the end of a conclusion of a dissertation or a paper, because it's not technically over yet. It's still going to move forward, because it's a real world that you're dealing with. So this is the instigation into that. This instigates that move into that real world context. It sort of widens its focus. That's what's happening there. And then into the fourth paragraph here, you'll notice the conclusion is a lot shorter. I think, in all honesty, I've seen this whole dissertation. I think, in all honesty, they just got a bit tight for words, and they felt like the conclusion was where they'd have to shave some words off, which is fine. But I still think it's a really good conclusion in terms of what they managed to do in 400 or 500 words or whatever it is. So this is the point they end on. They talk about future research. So this is one of the ways that you can widen out your scope. But notice at the end, there's no mention in that paragraph, or even, I think, after this first sentence in the third paragraph, there's no mention of the Arab Spring, because it's not actually, as strange to say this, it's not about that case study anymore. You know, it's what the case study represents, it's what it speaks to. So future research, this kind of stuff, they've got this phrase here, moving forward. So they're thinking about how the research is going to move forward. They're thinking about what needs to be done to advance our knowledge on this issue further. So this is the sort of area you want to end on, the sort of note you want to end on, is thinking about, you know, not just what have we learned, but where are we going with this, you know. And as I'm going to highlight in the next slide, the last sentence is really, really good. I think it's a really good last sentence for a conclusion in a dissertation in terms of what it's saying and the scope of it. But again, look at what's going on here. It's not a specific argument necessarily. It's not about the case study. It's about these themes and these ideas. Now, if I show you first 3 or 4 sentences or so from the introduction there that we looked at, and this is the last sort of 2 or 3 sentences from the conclusion that we've just been looking at. And what I've done is I've highlighted these particular words. And what you'll notice, remember I said earlier, the conclusion at the end sort of circles back and goes all the way to the beginning, all the way back to the beginning, like it goes full circle. That's exactly what's happening. Look at the scope of both passages. You know, it starts really broad, it ends really broad. And the idea is that you come full circle. So all of these themes and ideas that you're presenting at the beginning of the intro here, I wouldn't say they sort of fade and disappear, but what ends up happening is you become more specific and you talk about a case study, but all those themes are going on in the background. When you get to the end, you bring those themes back to the fore. They resurface, which doesn't mean they've not gone anywhere. They've been there the whole time, but they resurface. And what you're doing is you're drawing the reader's attention back to those dominant themes and ideas. So the idea that the dissertation comes full circle, this is really, really important. This is one of the ways to just really get your marker on board, because they'll notice that this is what you're doing. They'll notice that you're revisiting what you presented at the beginning. They'll like the idea that you're showing that sort of ability to closely control all this information that you've got, these big ideas and these big themes. And the idea of circling back to where you started is a very, very effective technique in writing. It's also a technique used in lots of different areas of work, like in film, in writing, in terms of stories, in music. Listen to certain songs, the way they start and the way they end. Very, very similar. It's the idea that you're returning to the same motif or idea. If anybody in the next 5 seconds in the chat can name that film, I will write your dissertation for you. No, see, you missed an absolutely golden opportunity there. Of course, I wouldn't have done that. I'm just joking, of course. That is, the film it's from doesn't actually matter. It's from a film called Gone Girl. But that on the left is the first image of the film, literally the first image of the film. That on the right is literally the last image of the film. And this is just to reinforce what I'm saying. It's a structure in writing called mirroring. Sometimes it's called mirroring. And it's the idea that you circle back. It's the idea that there are two images or two passages of text or something that mirror each other, that reflect each other. And I always think of the intro and conclusion as though they are bookends on a shelf. You know, you've got a shelf, you've got all the books that are lined up on the shelf, and you've got a bookend that end and a bookend that end. And that's like the intro and that's like the conclusion, and it holds it all up together. And the fact that they mirror each other, they reflect back on each other, is important. This is what you see in lots and lots of films. If you look at first images, last images, or first scenes, last scenes, you'll see that this is happening. Everything you need to know about the film is in that first scene. And then what happens is it revisits those ideas right again at the very end, and you go, oh, I get it all now. I get how it fits together. That's what's happening in this, in this film. The same shot. It's literally the same shot, but it shows you the movement forward in it, and it shows you how far you've advanced in the story by revisiting something from the beginning. So in this position, the character's in a vulnerable position. In this position at the end, she's in a powerful position. Now, taking this back to writing, think about what's going on at the beginning and how you can revisit those ideas again at the end. And earlier I was talking about, I glossed over how broad to start, like in terms of the opening of the introduction. Where do you start, with the example we've been looking at, for example? Do you start with social media generally, or do you start with the case study? It's completely up to you. But the question actually isn't where do I want to start, it's where do I want to end? And that should be where you start. So do you want to end talking about that case study? End there. Or do you want to end talking about social media and this kind of stuff? And you want to end there? Then start there. And this is what a lot of writers do when they write films and stuff. They often know they often know the end before they know the beginning, and then they write the beginning because they know the end. So it's a common technique. This is one of the ways to get extra marks, invisible marks almost, that will really impress your marker in your dissertation. It shows that you've got an ability to really control a lot of information. It's just a powerful technique. So I hope that makes sense. Just say a little bit more about the conclusion before we finish. Similar to intro, it should be around 5 to 10%. I would say often it will be more towards that 5% mark because you often are struggling for words. But often conclusion, you don't have to say that much because, if you think about the introduction, at that point of the dissertation, your reader knows nothing. At the point of the conclusion, they know everything, really. You're just sort of going to bring it all together and ease them out. So 5 to 10%, but often around the more 5% mark. Avoid any phrase like in conclusion or some variation of that. It's very, very cliched. It's also completely unnecessary because you'll have a subheading that says, or a chapter heading that says conclusion. Just, you don't need to say in conclusion. But often, as I said, it's the way you phrase the start. It's often clear because of the reflective register that you are starting a conclusion. So you don't need some cliched variation of in conclusion. As I said earlier, try and bring the dissertation to an end without closing it off. It's not the end like a story ends, in the sense that it's all sort of neatly tied up. It needs to feel like there's a degree of resolution. It needs to feel like there's closure, but don't close it off because it's not finished, in the sense that the research will continue moving forward and the whole real world context will continue moving forward. And I think something that's useful to think about as well, when you're writing your conclusion and you are writing your intro, imagine that your reader is only going to read abstract, intro, and conclusion before they actually decide whether they want to read the whole dissertation. Now, obviously, your marker has to read the whole dissertation. But imagine they're only going to read abstract, intro, conclusion, which, by the way, is a good reading technique when you're reading papers. And what that should do is focus the mind, because it's about, well, what do I need them to know? It's not lots of details, but what do I need them to know at these parts of the dissertation? And just try and give them that essential information. That's all you need to do. You don't need to overburden them with too much. Okay, I'm going to sort of finish it there. I'm going to summarize. So I hope that all made sense, and I hope I've sort of stressed this relationship between the intro and conclusion, particularly the sort of beginning of the intro, beginning of the intro, end of the conclusion. My advice, on top of everything I've said already, is easier said than done, but try not to rush the writing of both of them. Don't leave it to the end, you know. You can write the intro at the beginning, you can write it for the first time at the end, it's up to you, but don't leave yourself a couple of days because you've spent too much time on the other chapters. It's two parts of the dissertation or any assignment really that really requires more attention than often people give it. Imagine reading something that you really like that ends on a really bad note, like a film that you really like that ends really badly. It just leaves you with a sour taste in your mouth. So try not to rush them. Write or revise them together. I often say I think you should write the intro first and then revisit it again at the end. If you want to write them both together at the end, you can, but definitely revise them together and think about the relationship between the two, particularly the beginning of the intro, end of the conclusion. Just a reminder as well about the SPRE model that we talked about and the CARS model. So the intro, watch this stuff back, look at the examples I've given you, follow that model, you can't really go wrong. Conclusion, similar again, think about those two parts, think about how you can summarize and synthesize the main information, get the main information across, but then think about how you can end on that wider note as well.